The air in West Dallas hung heavy with dust and the smell of scorched earth. It was the early 1930s, and America was limping through the Great Depression. Bread lines stretched around corners, banks boarded their windows, families burned furniture to stay warm, but in the shadow of every collapsed dream, someone saw an opportunity. Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born into poverty and hardship, the son of tenant farmers who lived on the edge of survival. The Barrows migrated to Dallas when Clyde was still a boy, settling in a shanty town of makeshift homes and lean-tos. Life in West Dallas was tough and unforgiving. Clyde learned early how to steal. At first it was petty things, turkeys, cars, tools, but soon, his ambition outgrew his fear. He was arrested multiple times before he turned 20. He didn't see jail as a warning. He saw it as a temporary inconvenience. By 1930, Clyde was doing time in the brutal East Ham prison farm. It was a hellish place, where prisoners labored in the fields under armed guard and slept on the floor in cages. There, he endured beatings, starvation, and sexual assault. The young man who went in with a sharp tongue came out colder, harder, and bent on never returning. Bonnie Parker, on the other hand, had once dreamed of being a poet. Born in Rowena, Texas in 1910, she was raised by her mother after her father died. Bonnie was smart, imaginative, and charming. She wrote verses in her notebooks and recited them like ballads. But dreams didn't hold up well in West Dallas either. At 16, she married a man who would soon disappear into the prison system. By the time she met Clyde Barrow, she was back living with her mother, working as a waitress, and craving something, anything, more. They met in January 1930. The details vary, but most agree it happened at a friend's house. Bonnie was helping a neighbor recover from a broken arm. Clyde walked through the door, and something happened. Whether it was chemistry, fate, or just shared pain disguised as passion, they were inseparable almost immediately. Only weeks later, Clyde was arrested and sent back to prison. Bonnie smuggled him a gun. He escaped, was recaptured, and served nearly 2 more years. When he was paroled in February 1932, Bonnie was waiting. The world they returned to was unforgiving. Clyde tried factory work but lasted only a few weeks. He hated authority, hated confinement. He believed that honest work would never earn enough to lift him out of the mud, and besides, the only skill prison had given him was violence. So he gathered a few trusted friends, Raymond Hamilton, Ralph Fultz, and a teenage runaway named W.D. Jones, and began robbing gas stations and grocery stores across Texas. They called themselves the Barrow Gang. At first, it was small jobs, quick strikes, fast getaways. They stole money, weapons, and most importantly, fast cars. Clyde favored the Ford V8, a machine he would later praise in a letter to Henry Ford for its speed and dependability. The gang operated across state lines, robbing stores in Oklahoma, Missouri, and Arkansas. They moved constantly, never staying in one place longer than a few nights. Bonnie was there from the beginning. Though not often the one holding the gun, she was no stranger to the danger. She was Clyde's confidant, his partner, and the calm voice in the middle of chaos. She cooked for the gang, kept notes, wrote poetry. She was arrested at least once during a failed burglary and jailed for 2 months. When she was released, she chose to return to Clyde instead of staying safe. Violence followed them. In August 1932, during a robbery in Stringtown, Oklahoma, Clyde and Hamilton shot and killed Deputy Eugene Moore and wounded another officer. This was the first lawman Clyde killed, but it would not be the last. From that moment, the Barrow Gang was not just a group of thieves, they were fugitives charged with murder. In March 1933, Clyde's older brother Buck Barrow received a pardon and rejoined the gang, bringing along his wife, Blanche. Buck had tried to go straight, but his loyalty to Clyde won out. Blanche, religious and terrified, followed Buck into the chaos reluctantly. Together, the 5 of them, Clyde, Bonnie, Buck, Blanche, and W.D. Jones, formed the most well-known version of the Barrow Gang. They needed a place to hide, somewhere quiet, out of reach, where they could catch their breath. They found it in Joplin, Missouri. The apartment was above a garage on a quiet residential street, just far enough from town to stay unnoticed, but not so isolated as to raise suspicion. The gang paid cash and moved in on April 1, 1933. For almost 2 weeks, they stayed inside during the day, drank whiskey at night, and played cards on the kitchen table. They backed their car into the garage after every outing, ready to flee at a moment's notice. Neighbors grew suspicious. The windows were always covered. Gunshots were heard more than once. likely from Clyde or Buck cleaning weapons. No one seemed to have a job. Eventually, someone tipped off the police, suspecting bootleggers. On April 13, a 5-man team of law enforcement officers approached the garage apartment. They expected to find liquor. Instead, they walked into a war zone. The officers were poorly armed and unprepared. Clyde opened fire first. Constable Wes Harriman was shot dead before he cleared the garage. Detective Harry McGinnis was fatally wounded trying to return fire. The other officers ducked behind cars and trees, overwhelmed by the gang's automatic weapons. Clyde, with his beloved bar in hand, sprayed the driveway while the gang loaded into the Ford. As the car tore away, Buck jumped out and dragged the dying McGinnis out of their path. Blanche, screaming, barely made it inside before Clyde floored the gas pedal. The gang escaped, but the blood they left behind would stain their legacy forever. In their rush, they left behind something else, something more damaging than bullets or blood. A camera. Inside were rolls of undeveloped film, snapshots of their time in hiding. When the photos were developed, they showed Bonnie and Clyde posing with pistols, embracing on car hoods, laughing with rifles in hand. In one, Bonnie grins while pretending to hold Clyde hostage. In another, she smirks with a cigar in her mouth and a revolver at her side. The press devoured the images. They hit the front page of every major newspaper in the country. Bonnie and Clyde, until then mostly unknown outside of law enforcement, became national figures overnight. The public was captivated. They were young, good-looking, and rebellious. They weren't just criminals, they were celebrities. But fame came at a cost. With every headline, every photo, the pressure grew. Every small-town sheriff now knew their faces. Police began arming up and shooting first. The gang had fewer places to hide. Every gas station clerk and hotel manager could be a risk. The days of quiet escapes were over. And Bonnie was injured. Just 2 months later, near Wellington, Texas, Clyde crashed their car into a dried creek bed. The battery acid leaked through the floor and soaked Bonnie's leg, burning her skin to the bone. She screamed for hours. The gang, unable to go to a hospital, nursed her in the woods. She never fully recovered. From then on, she could barely walk. Clyde often carried her in and out of the car. They were wounded, physically and emotionally. But they kept moving. Every day on the run was another day alive. They knew it couldn't last forever. Bonnie could no longer walk without help. After the Wellington crash in June 1933, the acid burns on her right leg left deep scars that never healed. Her skin blistered and peeled, the flesh turning raw, her mobility reduced to limping or being carried by Clyde. Even as her body failed, she stayed at his side. No matter how many bullets had been fired or how many lives had been lost, she had made her choice long ago. By midsummer, the Barrow gang was back in Missouri. They checked into a pair of cabins at the Red Crown Tourist Court in Platte City on July 18, 1933. Clyde paid in coins and requested an attached garage. Blanche signed the register under a false name. Once again, their behavior attracted attention. Extra meals, blackout curtains, and their refusal to allow cleaning staff raised suspicions. The hotel manager contacted law enforcement. Officers from Missouri Highway Patrol and local deputies surrounded the cabins that night, believing they might be facing armed robbers. They underestimated their quarry. The gunfire that followed was deafening. Clyde and Buck opened fire with automatic weapons through the cabin walls. Buck was shot in the head almost immediately, the bullet tearing through his skull. He stumbled but did not fall. Blanche screamed and tried to pull him to safety. Bonnie, barely able to move, still managed to fire from the window to cover their escape. Clyde crashed through a police barricade in the Ford V8 and sped away into the darkness. They abandoned the car in the woods near Dexter, Iowa, and took refuge in a thicket. For days, they hid with no food, swarmed by insects, watching Buck die slowly as infection took hold. He faded in and out of consciousness, his head soaked in blood, his breathing rattled. On July 24, lawmen discovered the camp. A second shootout followed. Bonnie and Clyde escaped with W.D. Jones through the underbrush, but Buck and Blanche were captured. Buck died 5 days later in a hospital. Blanche, blind in one eye from flying glass, was sentenced to prison. Now there were 3, but the damage was irreversible. Bonnie was wounded, Clyde was haunted. W.D. Jones, still just a teenager, had seen more carnage than most soldiers. Their once loyal inner circle had been reduced to corpses and handcuffs. The glamour was gone. They were dirty, sick, tired. They lived on the road, sleeping in fields, eating canned beans, robbing gas stations for loose change. The dream of big scores was long behind them. By the end of 1933, public sentiment was turning. They were no longer the darlings of the Great Depression. The photos from Joplin had been replaced by bloodier headlines. Police killings, carjackings, armed kidnappings. The public now saw them not as rebellious lovers, but as a dangerous, uncontrollable threat. States began coordinating better. Lawmen carried automatic weapons and shot first. The country was uniting against Bonnie and Clyde. Still, they moved. Still, they planned. In January 1934, Clyde pulled off one of the boldest prison breaks in Texas history. With help from Henry Methvin, a fellow criminal, Clyde attacked Eastham prison farm. The plan was personal. Eastham had brutalized him. Now he returned with firepower. In the chaos, he freed several inmates, including longtime gang member Raymond Hamilton. A prison guard was shot and killed during the escape. The raid made national news. It embarrassed Texas law enforcement and exposed major flaws in the prison system. But it also sealed Bonnie and Clyde's fate. After the Eastham raid, Texas officials authorized a covert task force to end the Barrow gang once and for all. Leading that task force was Frank Hamer, a former Texas Ranger with a reputation for precision and patience. He had tracked murderers, corrupt politicians, and lynch mobs. He knew how to wait. He studied the Barrow gang's habits. Clyde always circled back. He had patterns, routes, preferences. He favored small roads, avoided cities, and rarely crossed unfamiliar terrain. By spring of 1934, Hamer had predicted the final loop: rural Louisiana, near Gibbsland. Clyde had developed a friendship with fellow outlaw Henry Methvin, and Methvin's family farm became a frequent stop. On April 1, Bonnie and Clyde killed 2 highway patrolmen near Grapevine, Texas. A few days later, they killed a police officer in Oklahoma during another confrontation. The public had enough. Even those who once admired their boldness turned away. The killings were seen as executions. One of the slain officers had been engaged to be married. The image of Bonnie laughing over his body, though likely false, spread across the front pages. Clyde's recklessness was becoming desperation. Bonnie's pain worsened. W.D. Jones abandoned the gang and later surrendered to police. Only Clyde and Bonnie remained. The road ahead was shrinking. Frank Hamer knew it. He worked with local lawmen and reached out to Henry Methvin's father, Ivy Methvin, offering him a deal. If Ivy helped lure Bonnie and Clyde into a trap, his son might receive leniency. Ivy agreed. The plan was simple: park a truck on a quiet road outside Gibbsland. Make it look like it broke down. When Clyde saw it, he would stop to help. That was the moment the officers would strike. On the morning of May 23, 1934, Bonnie and Clyde drove a stolen Ford V8 down the rural road, approaching the Methvin property. Bonnie was eating a sandwich. Clyde was focused on the road. He slowed the car as he saw Ivy Methvin's truck in the ditch. 6 officers waited in the brush, their weapons drawn, breaths held. Clyde never had a chance to hit the brake. The first shots hit him in the head. The bullet exploded through the windshield, killing him instantly. The car rolled slightly forward and stopped. Bonnie screamed. A fraction of a second later, she was hit by a volley of gunfire. The shooting continued for over 20 seconds. More than 130 rounds were fired into the car. When the dust settled, Bonnie and Clyde were slumped against each other, lifeless, soaked in blood, shredded by bullets. They had carried weapons, but never touched them. There was no warning, no chance to surrender. The officers knew they wouldn't take them alive, and neither had Bonnie and Clyde ever intended to go back to prison. Within an hour, word spread. Locals arrived in droves, trampling the crime scene, tearing apart the car for souvenirs. Someone tried to cut off Clyde's trigger finger. A woman soaked her handkerchief in Bonnie's blood. The officers did their best to hold the crowd back, but it was chaos. Their bodies were taken to a funeral home in Arcadia, Louisiana. Thousands came to view them. Photographs of their corpses in the bullet-riddled car flooded newspapers the next morning. There was no longer any debate. Bonnie and Clyde were dead. They were buried in separate cemeteries in Dallas. Bonnie's mother refused to allow them to be laid to rest together, despite their wish. Clyde was buried beside his brother Buck. Bonnie was buried beneath a gravestone inscribed with a soft, poetic tribute. She was still wearing the wedding ring from her first husband. Their car, riddled with bullets, eventually became a traveling exhibit. It still exists today, encased behind glass in a Nevada casino. The seats remain stained. The windshield remains shattered. The legend, like the vehicle, is frozen in time. In the end, Bonnie and Clyde weren't heroes. They weren't symbols of justice or rebellion. They were two young people consumed by violence and circumstance. They left behind broken families, dead lawmen, and a trail of theft, terror, and blood. But their story lingers, not because of what they stole or who they killed, but because of who they were. They were lovers in a dying world, reaching for freedom in the only way they knew how. They were fire and gasoline, bound together until the end, and in the stillness after the last shot, America didn't just mourn or condemn them. It remembered them.